Welcome to Supply Chain Insights Webinar 2015 Supply Chains to Admire. I'm your host, Allison Crawford. We've wrapped up our research at the beginning of September and announced the 26 winners of our Supply Chains to Admire work at our Global Summit. Today, we're going to walk you through the details of how companies won and, more importantly, what you can do to repeat their success and become a supply chain to admire yourself. But before we get started, there are a few action items to cover. First, we're recording today's session and we'll post it on our on-demand webinar page. You can visit our website to listen to this or any of our other webinars. Second, we'll send out the slides to all attendees within 24 hours of the conclusion of our presentation. We encourage you to share these slides with others in your organization, and if you have questions, either reach out to Laura or myself to set up a conversation. Third, we want to hear your questions about our findings. Please post to the Q&A or chat function to the left of your screen. We've left time at the end of the webinar to address all of your questions. Lastly, we'll be live tweeting the event, so if you'd like to join in the social media conversation, please use the hashtag STIWebinar. Now, let me introduce Lora Cecere, founder of Supply Chain Insights, prolific author and blogger, supply chain expert with deep industry expertise in research as well as line of business. So with that, let me pass this over to Laura.
Thank you so much, Allison, and thanks to the folks on the line. As I go through the slide deck, I'd love to see some questions down in the chat window. You can see down below there's a question box. If you can put your questions in that box as we go along, that would be great. Supply Chains to Admire research has been developed to really help supply chain leaders to understand what is supply chain excellence. So like other industry analysts that write for the IT leader, I write for the supply chain leader. Our focus is really to say, what are the supply chains to admire and what are the characteristics? You know, and it's tough because when we look at the evolution of supply chain practices, you know, it's about 30 years in evolution that we've had a supply chain, and the average company has had a supply chain organization for 15 years, which is pretty new to the organization, and people are trying to figure out what does it mean. And we also see in about 1/3 of companies that they've evolved a supply chain center of excellence. But in our research, we find that 1 in 2 companies actually are not able to make the supply chain center of excellence effective. And one of the struggles is, what is supply chain excellence? And, you know, that sounds easy, but I've been writing about it for about 15 years. And the more I write about it, the more I have questions. And so the research is really designed around questions that should be asked by the supply chain leader and answers of where we're at. Before we get started, I want to just start with some basic definitions to be sure we're all aligned. In the Supply Chains to Admire work, we start with the metrics that matter. And the metrics that matter are the metrics, the supply chain ratios, that have the highest correlation to market capitalization. One of our goals in building this methodology was to have a way that supply chain leaders could define value in their discussion with finance. One of the observations we have is that often the conversation with finance is about the lowest cost. And there is a lot more around value than cost. And we wanted to try to help with a language that could help people to make the discussion meaningful between the supply chain organization and the finance organization. The second concept that you'll hear today is a concept called market-driven. And I've written for about a decade on the concept of demand-driven, and market-driven takes the concept of demand-driven and makes it even one step beyond, as we not only connect demand to the front office, but we orchestrate demand from the customer's customer to supplier's supplier bidirectionally. And it's that horizontal process orchestration that really underpins a lot of the supply chain development we're going to talk about. When supply chains operate as a function, really focused on customer service and logistics, and when organizations reward functions, not align metrics cross-functionally, they're not able to really make progress on the metrics that matter and drive the supply chains to admire performance. One of the first steps that we had to do in developing this methodology, and we're still discussing it, and it's very difficult to get this right, and I'll give you some insights into it as I go through the research, is how do you group industries? Because one of the things I feel really strongly about is that you can't put all industries in a spreadsheet and shake them up and declare a winner. Instead, what I have done is really looked at industries by peer group and looked at the trends by peer group. And you have to start with what is an industry. And it's hard because you have conglomerates. So is J&J a consumer packaged goods company, a pharmaceutical company, a medical device company? Well, we all know it's all three. But how do you rate them in the companies to admire? It's an open question for us today, and one that we're still working on. The companies that I'll show you in the analysis are companies that are cleaner, Procter & Gamble's CPG and Intel is Semiconductor. But for large conglomerates, we're still working on the right methodology. A lot of our work starts with year-over-year trend analysis. When I first started this work 4 years ago, I thought that supply chain leaders made progress much faster than I actually see in the financial results. And so what we started to do was to plot year-over-year progress on metrics that matter for supply chain leaders in orbit charts. And the orbit charts show the year-over-year progression, and I'll show you a number of orbit charts today. And the patterns of the orbit charts speak to me. As I have worked on this methodology for the last 4 years, the first thing I start with is the orbit chart of the individual company, and then I take the orbit chart of the individual company versus the peer group, and it's the patterns that speak to you, and I hope to sensitize you to that in today's discussion. So from the orbit charts, what we saw were a number of patterns, and we needed to build a methodology or a way to judge improvement. And we built the methodology called the Supply Chain Index, which looks at the intersection of two metrics that matter, like inventory turns and operating margin, or growth and return on invested capital. And the Supply Chain Index looks at, are we making progress at that intersection based upon the orbit charts? And we built this methodology with Arizona State University, and we're still refining it. And we publish the methodology openly, and we encourage you to use it. And then the Supply Chains to Admire analysis is an analysis of companies that both perform higher on the metrics that matter than their peer group. So you start by taking all the industries and putting them in peer group. You ask the first question of which companies perform better than the average for a time period on the metrics that matter, which are growth, return on invested capital, operating margin, and inventory turns. And then you apply the Supply Chain Index to say, are you making improvement? And that's an important dialogue, because what I find is that companies that are driving improvement can often have the most to improve. It's sort of like the TV show The Biggest Loser. The guy that is the biggest with the most weight will often lose the most in the contest. And so a company that has really worked on supply chain processes for 30 years has a tougher time driving improvement. And so in the Supply Chains to Admire, what we're looking for are companies making improvement against the peer group. And that's a tough thing for a mature company, as you'll see in the analysis. Now, why did I do this? Well, I worked at a company by the name of AMR, and AMR was purchased by Gartner. And when I was at AMR, we worked on the development of what was called the AMR Top 25, which when AMR got purchased by Gartner, it became the Gartner Top 25. And as we sat around talking research analysts, I've felt very uncomfortable with the methodology in a number of areas. And one of the reasons why I left Gartner was my uncomfortability the fact that I just don't embrace the Gartner Top 25, and I've written pretty openly about this. And I'll let you make your own decision, but I just want to give you a comparison of the methodology so that you're grounded. The Top 25 by Gartner looks at large companies. It looks at Fortune 1000 companies. Our goal was to build a methodology that would allow us to look at companies irrespective of size. So I had a lot of companies. They were mid-market companies, or they were startups, or maybe they were divisions of companies, and they wanted a methodology that could work for them, that could be adapted so that its peer groups changed, et cetera, and that was the goal of the methodology. Now, in the Gartner Top 25, we're looking at return on assets with a 3-year average. We're looking at inventory turns for the past year, and that ranks 15%. And we're also looking at growth at a 10% level, and they're looking year over year. And so 10% of the weighting is growth, and 50% is opinion. Now, there are a couple of concerns I have about that. One is that return on assets does not correlate as high as return on invested capital to market capitalization, as you'll see in some of the charts. And the second thing is it's 50% opinion, and I don't think we know enough at this point in time in the evolution of supply chains to rank supply chains. I always felt uncomfortable as an analyst ranking supply chains. And the third thing is that we're not looking, I think, in that methodology over a long enough period of time. What I'll show you in the orbit charts is that it takes at least 3 years to really start to see progress in financial metrics. So our analysis, which we're still working on, still young, still second year, not perfect, is to really look at, are companies performing better than their peer group by industry, which the Gartner Top 25 puts all companies together and basically compares companies across industries. We're comparing companies within industries. And is there improvement better than the peer group? Now, which one's better, I'll let you decide. What I think is important is that we're starting to evolve a definition of supply chain excellence. Because in my view, 9 out of 10 supply chains are stuck. We can see it in the data. I'll show it to you in the orbit charts. And I find it ironic that we talk about best practices, and company after company will get on every stage at every event and talk about how much money they've saved, how much inventory they've saved. But when we look at the results, and the results at the balance sheet level, what we find is that the industries have very, very different rhythms and cycles with different patterns, and so that's why I think you've really got to compare companies within a peer group. But when you look at the data, what we've made improvement in are 2 factors in the supply chain. One is in revenue per employee. We've definitely improved the productivity of employees. We've not translated that necessarily into operating margin at the level that many people think we have. And this is a comparison of 2006 to 2013 across industries. But the other factor that we have greatly improved is cash to cash. Now, cash to cash is a compound metric that's made of receivables, inventory, and payables. What we have done to improve cash to cash, because you want to have a small number in cash to cash, and you can see that many industries have greatly improved cash to cash, is we have elongated payables. And when we elongate payables, we push cost and waste back on the supplier. Well, when we look at inventory turns, you can see that there's much less progress in inventory turns. And in some industries, because we want inventory turns to be turning high, some industries are going backwards. So the beverage industry is going backwards, the pharmaceutical industry is going backwards, the medical device industry is going backwards, and consumer packaged goods are going backwards. And why is that? I mean, we've had lots of projects. Well, a lot of it has to do with complexity, and it has to do with the maturation of inventory practices. As we move from measuring inventory levels to really measuring form and function of inventory, it requires us to be far more diligent in the design of the supply chain, in the management of cycle stock and production planning, and the management of complexity, of management of in-transit stock. And, we have lengthening of trade lanes with what's happening in ocean shipping. We also have increases in cycle stock due to complexity of product portfolios. And so many times people are only looking at safety stock when we really need to be looking at the form and function of inventory across the supply chain. And we've had some changes in business, but we also have some maturation of processes. The other thing is growth is slowing, and as growth slows, the supply chain matters more than ever. And as we think about supply chain excellence and we think about our ability to deliver on the same cost, quality, and customer service, given a slowdown in growth and given an increase in demand volatility, when we talk to supply chain leaders, and this is from studies that we did last year, we do about 40 studies a year, and we ask companies to give us their descriptors. They describe the supply chain as traditional, tactical, cautious, with room improvement, 1 out of 3. And many people feel this, but they don't know how to express it. And they want a supply chain that's agile, that's fast, that's proactive, that's aligned. And we want to help people to get there, but we don't get there by the traditional thinking and really looking at driving efficiency. Instead, what we've got to do is we've got to think past functional silos, past a project-based approach, and really focus on the metrics that matter. So let's begin the journey on the supply chains to admire work. We're doing this work because we think it matters. We think supply chains are stuck. We want to help to understand what drives balance sheet performance. So let's start with this simple chart. When I used to sell technology, I would go into companies and I would say, if you buy my technology, I'm going to help you at the intersection of inventory turns and operating margin. And I didn't know it, but I lied, right? I didn't realize how hard it is to make improvement at this intersection and how many factors. And, the complexity of this has really become clear to me through this analysis and the study. And the supply chain is a complex system with complex processes and increasing complexity. And I think in the early decade of my writing, I understood that the processes were complex, and I understood that we were increasing complexity. But what I didn't fully grasp until I started working on this methodology is the fact that we have a complex system here which is nonlinear. The relationships are very nonlinear between the metrics that matter. And, I stay awake thinking about we're trying to model nonlinear relationships with linear optimization. But for more on that, I'll take you to my blog. Let's get back to the supply chains to admire. So after we put companies into industries, we started to look at the effective frontier, which was the intersection of growth, profitability, cycles, and complexity. And I would love to add another circle on this effective frontier for customer service, but I don't have data. There is no good data source that I can find for customer service across industries. I can do private benchmarking with companies to understand their customer service, but that is a circle that I'd like to add in later methodology descriptors, but I'm struggling to find the data. So to come up with the metrics that matter, we started with the correlations that I talked about, and we looked at the industries and we looked at the supply chain financial ratios. Our goal was to be able to really focus on financial ratios because the financial ratios help us to go across industries, across currencies, across company sizes in a way that we can do much easier than if we were dealing with absolute numbers. So as you can see, days of inventory or inventory turns have a high correlation to market capitalization, as do the other elements of cash to cash. And so a lot of the impact on value comes with the management of working capital. We picked operating margin and inventory turns as primary metrics because we feel like that the supply chain leader can have an impact on inventory and can have an impact on operating margin. The other thing you can see is that return on invested capital has a higher correlation than return on assets. We picked return on invested capital because we also think that one of the things that the supply chain leader is charged with is the ability to manage assets. So then we start building orbit charts to look at companies' performance. And what we saw were patterns that were kind of gnarly, right? So this is Wal-Mart, and you can see the best scenario is in the upper right-hand corner. But Wal-Mart has primarily made improvements in inventory, not in operating margin. So the way you look at this is you trace the line from the 2000 point through 2013, and you can see it is not a straight line. It is not a straight line to the best scenario. Let's look at Apple. You can see that Apple also is making progress in one metric, but not in both, which is operating margin and not moving towards the best scenario. Let's look at Dow Chemical. Dow Chemical is at about the same level today as it was in 2000, right? And we look at the mergers and acquisitions. Dow Chemical was not designed at a supply chain level to deliver reliability results. So we built orbit charts for industries in our Metrics That Matter series. We probably built about 4,000 charts, and we looked at which companies were making progress and which companies were not on the metrics that matter. And it was then that we hired Arizona State University to come and help us to develop the methodology for the Supply Chain Index, which is a measurement of supply chain improvement. And in this, what we do is we take an orbit chart and we look at the intersection of return on invested capital with growth, and that ranking is 30%. We look at the improvement at the intersection of inventory turns and operating margin, and that ranking is 30%. And we look at the tightness of the pattern, because if you have a very random pattern, like Dow Chemical is a random pattern, it shows the lack of control in the supply chain. And so resiliency, or the tightness of the pattern, is 30%. And each of these factors counts equally in the development of the supply chain index, which we use as a measurement of improvement. So the next step is to look at which companies have performed better than their peer group during the period. And for this year's analysis, we looked at 2006 to 2014 and 2009 to 2014. Now, the reason I can't go back further than 2006 is the date of spotty. I did not start the work early enough, and so we have to collect the data and roll it into a database. And the reason I don't have a shorter time period, because we also, in some of our earlier writing, had reflected on 2011 to 2014, a short history doesn't give you enough of a pattern. So the work is focused on 2006 to 2014, 2009 and 2014, and we're looking for the companies that have driven both performance better than their peer group and also driven improvement. So this is our list of companies to admire. You know, this year we added retail. Last year we had no retailers. This year we have one pharmaceutical company, Biogen. We also have one medical device company, Coloplast, and you can see that, you know, the high-tech or the discrete industries have more companies that are ranking than we have in the process industries. The other thing that we see is that there are a number of companies, about 30%, that make it for 2 years. InBev, which has done an incredible job on the management of inventories in a global supply chain, really a leader in network design. General Mills, also great work in network design. Eastman Chemical has done some great work in planning. Audi and their work in the supply chain. Intel, building talent. Cisco Systems, the building of value networks. And Nike are the winners 2 years in a row. It's hard to really keep the performance. It's a tough measure. You know, if you think about all publicly held companies, the fact that we only came up with 26 is indicative of just how tough it is. Now, in our follow-up to our recent conference from the Imagine conference that we did the second week in September, we asked 3 of the supply chains to admire winners to present, and these presentations are available on our website and also on our Global Summit site, and you can hear directly from the winners. Now let's get into the methodology and what happened. So when we take an industry peer group, this is consumer packaged goods, and this data is available for 26 segments, and I'm only going to have time today to go through a few of them. So we look at growth for the time periods, we look at operating margin, we look at inventory turns, we look at return on invested capital. We also give you information on revenue per employee to help you benchmark. And then we look at the supply chain rankings of who's driving the most improvement. Now you can see here Church & Dwight is driving the most recent improvement, and Tupperware has driven recent improvement along with Unilever. However, the companies that most people think about as the supply chain leaders, Colgate and Procter & Gamble, are struggling with improvement. And if we look at return on invested capital, Procter & Gamble is underperforming on return on invested capital, which is an opportunity for the company. So Clorox actually meets the supply chains to admire, and Kimberly-Clark is going backwards to the greatest degree. So this is Kimberly-Clark. If you trace the orbit chart of Kimberly-Clark from 2000 to 2014, you can see a very gnarly pattern. So again, we're measuring resiliency as well. A very gnarly pattern backwards, and about 2012 they started to drive some improvement. But when you think about Kimberly-Clark, they did a lot of business process outsourcing to a higher degree than anyone else in the industry, which I find is detrimental to the supply chains to admire. They also were late in developing a supply chain leader. That's a recent development in the organization. They've been very functional, and they've struggled to basically drive supply chain excellence in the time of declining volume. Now, if we look at rising stars in this particular industry, this is Clorox. Clorox, you can see from 2012 to 2014, has made improvement, and Church & Dwight is also making great improvement. This is a sign of improvement. However, when we look at the legacy leaders of Colgate and Procter & Gamble, you can see at the intersection of operating margin and inventory turns, Procter & Gamble, with the acquisition of Gillette, went backwards. In the last 2 years, they're starting to push backwards with some of the rationalization of the portfolio, which helps with complexity, and some of the work that they're doing around demand sensing and inventory management. Colgate has been plateaued for the last 4 years and starting to go backwards. Colgate was the top performer in this industry for many years. And if you look at Colgate versus Unilever, again, you can see Unilever is pushing forward, not at the peer group level of Colgate, but pushing forward. So it's a study of improvement and performance. And if you look at the beauty category, which again, all these charts are available in the report that we just published, this is the beauty category. Beauty performs at a lower level than consumer packaged goods, so we broke it out into a separate area. And the two companies that are driving performance and improvement are L'Oreal and Estee Lauder. So, what we did was we started taking it across industries, and these reports are in our Supply Chains to Admire work, and I know it's really a lot of data on a screen in a webinar, but I want to just help you to be sensitive to the methodology so that when you pick up the report, you can better understand it. This is the food industry, and the food industry is seeing declining industry growth as people have retreated from center store, and they've struggled with the redefinition of platforms that have happened through consolidation. And the best performing company is General Mills, and you can see General Mills has actually gone backwards, but when you compare them against the peer group of, this is General Mills, GIS versus Kellogg, you can see a distinctly different pattern. So even though they've gone backwards, it's within a very tight band. Kellogg's, on the other hand, has had multiple failed technology implementations, has lacked the supply chain leader, much more functional in orientation, and you can see the difference in both the pattern and the averages. So the boxes represent the averages. And then if we look at other comparisons of companies that are driving improvement, Hershey drove improvement when the board actually, was threatened to be taken over. They started a major effort to improve inventory, and they have had a great effort to improve supply chain design, to use planning tools, and you can see Hershey has made improvement year over year. In comparison, someone like Danone has lost ground, and so even though they're a higher performer. And so this is what we're studying. We're looking at who's making improvement and who's higher performer. We look at the beverage industry. The company that makes it is Anheuser-Busch. And if we look at Anheuser-Busch versus SAB-Miller, because we're looking within peer group, you can see that Anheuser-Busch, which is Bud in this, is actually higher performing than SAB-Miller. And you can see that with the exception of 2013 to 2014, they've been driving improvement. This is quite different than what we see in the beverage industry, where both of the major beverage companies are going backwards. The beverage industry is also under attack for growth, declining growth, but we must design the supply chain to sustain progress in the face of declining growth. And so these patterns, even though Coca-Cola is higher performing than PepsiCo, are not patterns of supply chain excellence. If we look in the apparel industry, Nike is the winner. And if we look at the actual metrics, you can see Nike scores versus apparel leaders. And again, Nike is in the middle of this pack. You seldom see a supply chains to admire winner having number one on the index, because it's just a much higher level of supply chain performance. It's tougher to drive improvement if you're a supply chain leader. But supply chains to admire is looking at, are you performing higher than your peer group, and are you driving improvement? So this is a comparison of Nike and Adidas, the two shoe makers. Nike also makes apparel. But, they are a comparative peer group. And if you look at Nike, you can see that the diamond and the box represent the averages for that period. It's a much higher performing company. And if you look at Adidas, you can see that we have a downward trend, and we also have a lower performing company. We often will find that companies who have this kind of performance, which about 60% of companies are underperforming and have a downward performance, are not aware of it. And when we go in and we show the orbit charts, it's sort of like honesty being spoken. And so the more I work with the methodology, the more that I feel that it helps companies. This is the chemical industry. Chemical industry is a tough industry, sitting 3 and 4 layers back in the supply chain. The demand signal is very distorted, and costs are tight. Margins are lower in the chemical industry than you'll see in consumer packaged goods or pharmaceuticals. And the patterns are gnarly. They're bigger patterns. So Eastman Chemical won the supply chains to admire, and BASF is going backwards. So BASF was on the supply chains to admire for 2014, but they fall off this year because of the lack of improvement in the supply chain index. And you can see that tail that's starting to go backwards on 2014. Now, it'll be interesting to see if Eastman Chemical will fall off next year, because you can see the tails going backwards. We'll have to see what happens in 2015. They rate higher on the supply chain index because of that big movement of 2012 to 2013, but sustaining that into 2015 will be their challenge. Now, in pharmaceutical, one company makes a list, which is Biogen. It's the first time that we have a pharmaceutical company making the list. And Biogen has done some great work around network design and inventory. And AstraZeneca is a top performer, but is going backwards. And so we often will see top performers but going backwards. You can contrast that to J&J, who is basically moving downward on inventory turns and making improvement in operating margin. The secret here on this particular methodology is to be able to drive improvement in a portfolio of metrics together. And you can see this in Novo Nordisk pattern. Novo Nordisk is actually driving improvement, while Eli Lilly, their nearest competitor, has actually struggled for balance and resiliency. So, lots to cover in the webinar. I'm just trying to give you a high-level view so that you can go back and you can pick up the reports and you can pick up the research and you can apply it to your company. At the back of the report, we share the mathematical calculations for the supply chain index, and it allows you to use the data and to actually calculate if you want to look at a different peer group. This is the semiconductor industry. Intel makes the list again. You can see Intel is both top performing and they also are driving improvement. And TSMC falls off the list because they are losing progress. Intel spoke at the conference, and in this chart I want to compare Intel to Qualcomm just so you can see the relative patterns. You tend to see more distorted patterns in the B2B discrete space than you do in the consumer packaged goods space. They tend to be gnarlier, but you can see that while Qualcomm is higher performing, they're going backwards. Intel is making small increments forwards. And the methodology rewards consistency and continuity of purpose. So when you get the report and you sit back and you think about it, there are a couple of things that speak to me from this 4 years of research. The metrics that I think matter, and I think we can only measure 5 to 7 metrics consistently across the organization, are growth, operating margin, inventory turns, return on invested capital, and customer service as measured by the customer. Now, as an organization, you may want to put EBITDA in place of operating margin. That's fine. Cost per case is not a complete metric, so I would not recommend that. You may want to look at gross margin. That's fine also. You may want to look at days of inventory versus inventory turns. That's fine. But not working capital or really looking at cash to cash. And the reason is that's a compound metric, and the cash to cash working capital metric as a goal may hide the fact that you're not making improvement on inventory. The continuation of elongation of payables really bothers me because we've never had a more fragile supply base. So how do you get unstuck? Well, one of the things I think you do is you focus cross-functionally on a balanced portfolio of metrics, and you bonus employees against that portfolio. So it could be something like 50% corporate metrics and 50% functional metrics. And the functional metrics really need to be driven based upon reliability. So you don't get unstuck if you reward manufacturing for the lowest cost of case manufactured, or return on assets, or procurement for the lowest cost of goods sourced. Instead, what you've got to do is you've got to align those functions cross-functionally around total cost and around the balance sheet. And so if you look at functional cost measurements, you'll throw the supply chain out of balance. The second thing is that the functions need to really be focused on reliability. How can I drive reliability and functional excellence? Things like mean absolute percent error reduction and bias reduction in forecasting, improving first pass yield, OEE, which is a measurement of utilization and manufacturing, on-time delivery, orders shipped complete, hands-free orders, schedule attainment, your safety metrics, your employee turnover. These are all measurements of reliability. And if you focus the functions on reliability and you focus cross-functionally on the metrics that matter, you can drive value. to a higher degree. And one of the things that I think companies struggle with is what is value and what is supply chain excellence. And that's why we've developed the methodology, and we'd love to help you in your organization. But, if I sit back from all the orbit charts and all the writing and all the reports, I ask myself, what drives top performance? And I've worked with many of these companies for many years, and, I ask myself, think about the differences between the pile of orbit charts of 90% of companies that are stuck and the pile of the orbit charts where 10% of the companies are stuck. And one of the things that I see is continuity of leadership. From each of these orbit charts, I can see a supply chain leader. I can see Greg Polson at Estee Lauder, or I can see James Foster at Clorox. I can see Jason Ryman at Hershey. I can see Keith Harrison's work at Procter & Gamble. There has been a leader who has been, managing the cross-functional efforts across source, make, and deliver. And there's been a focus on supply chain talent development. People are building supply chain leaders. We just can't have third parties like Apex and SCORE or CSEMP deliver training. We've got to take ownership for our own training development and focus on a multi-year strategy. I think that building supply chain excellence really requires us to build the discipline. It's sort of like training your body for a triathlon. You don't get out and after training for a week and run a triathlon. You work years to build, the stamina to be able to have the skill level and the different types of activity to be able to compete. And I think it's very similar to a triathlon or a decathlete's training to be able to work cross-functionally. There also has to be clear governance to guide cross-functional decision-making, and this is a struggle of the global multinational, and it's one that I think we don't think enough about of should we make decisions and how do we make the pivot. So we have global companies, we have businesses within the global companies, and we have regional needs. And those individual interests are often competing. And so as we think about improving decision support tools through advanced planning systems or cross-functional processes like sales and operations planning, one of the issues is we're not good at clarifying the governance around how we make decisions. And in the supply chains to admire work, the companies that I see have made progress are clear about governance, about how do we make decisions, how do regional inputs get into the demand plan, how do regional inputs affect the product portfolio, what is the role of the corporate function and design of the supply chain, how do we set inventory targets, is it a role of the business or a role of the corporation. And I think that is still something that we're very new at, and for the global multinational is extremely important. The other thing is strengthen horizontal processes. The horizontal processes that I think matter are revenue management, so effectiveness and demand shaping and what we're doing in the channel, sales and operations planning, being able to look at commercial processes and operations processes together to align, to orchestrate, and to drive margin improvement and growth. Supplier development, the design of our supply base to be able to be effective, not just lowest cost, but effective, to be reliable. We've got a great issue right now with supplier fragility. And corporate social responsibility to be able to look at, how the supply chain can actually minimize waste and improve the planet. And also product development. And the focus on the horizontal processes and the global governance is extremely important. And last, and something I write a lot about, is excellence in supply chain planning, network design, and inventory management. The companies that are making it on the supply chains to admire are pushing up the pendulum on what these processes mean. So I'm going to close and just ask you to think about this term supply chain and supply chain excellence. 30 years have passed for supply chain history. It's still very new, still very young. And we talk about supply chain excellence and we talk about driving value. And I think we've got to think hard about what do those words mean, because I think supply chain matters. I think it matters to the balance sheet. I think it matters to economies. I think it matters to the planet. And as we think about driving excellence, we have to educate the organization on what it means and connect the work we're doing in supply chain to the balance sheet. And it's for that reason that we write and we produce works, and we recently published a new Shaman's Journal. Our Shaman's Journal books are the books we self-publish. If you're interested in getting one of these, we handed them out at our conference. Just let us know. They're the best blog posts, best read blog posts that I've written on the Shaman's Journal. And we have two books that are on Amazon. Bricks Matter, that was published in 2012 when I first started this journey to write about supply chain. 2012, I believed I'd write a celebratory book on supply chain management about how we had improved cost, improved operating margin, and inventory turns. And it was then that I found that 9 out of 10 companies were stuck. So at that point in time, you can see the early work on the supply chains to admire. And then Metrics That Matter, which was a continuation of the work in Bricks Matter, but is a story of a leadership team that is trying to drive supply chain excellence, was written to really help people to start to see year-over-year changes in orbit charts. In a couple of years, we'll publish our third book in that series, which is called Leadership That Matters. And if your organization is moving up the charts on the supply chains to admire, I'd love to write your story, because I think we don't have enough stories in the industry around real people doing real work. So with that, let's see if we have any questions. Allison, any questions from the audience?
Yeah, Laura, we have a couple. The first one that came in was, what is the recommended evolution for planning metrics besides OTIF, MAPE, bias, schedule attainment, I get inverse DOS, looks like? That was the first question.
Yeah. So what are the recommended evolution for planning metrics besides OTIF, which is on time and full, MAPE, which is mean absolute percent error, bias, which is looking at the bias of the forecast, schedule attainment, and inventory? I have a strong preference for MAPE, or coefficient of variance. I think weighted MAPE will distort people's belief that they're making progress when they're not, because of the long tail of the supply chain and the fact that many companies have driven a lot of new products into the product line, and the actual MAPE is much worse than the weighted MAPE. So I like MAPE and bias. I also think keep it simple. On our inventory metrics, I'm always amazed how difficult we make things. I mean, I think we've got to stay away from compound metrics, and I like inventory turns or days of inventory. I also like the ideas around schedule attainment, where we look at what we planned to make and what was actually made in production planning. So that's my belief. I think on customer service on time and in full, I think that we need to look at those separately. I have actually changed my mind on the complete order or the perfect order, and the fact that when we measure the perfect order, we don't see the drivers. So that's my thought on that question. Vikram asked if there was analysis of retail. Yes, Vikram, there was. It's in the report. We looked at mass retail, we looked at apparel retail, and we looked at grocery retail separately. The retailers have actually made progress in this last couple of years. So I'm proud that we now have some retailers on the supply chains to admire. And then the operational definition of reliability versus supply chain performance. One of the issues I think we have in supply chain is what is reliability. And so I talked about, focusing on functional reliability metrics here in this slide. I think for your organization, you need to sit down and think about each function and what drives reliability. In the actual orbit charts, resiliency is also a measurement of reliability, which is the pattern and the type of pattern. And so, thinking through what this means to your organization in a purposeful way, I think is a great way to get started. Any other questions, Allison?
It doesn't look like we have any questions in the queue, so if anyone does have any questions, please send them through now. Laura, I can give you a couple minutes to do some final thoughts, and we can wrap up if there's no more questions.
Yeah, so we will do this analysis again for 2016 for our Supply Chains to Admire work. We do an annual conference called Imagine. Imagine 2016 will take place in September 2016 at the Phoenician in Scottsdale, Arizona. And we'll continue the work. We'll be writing Supply Chains to Admire reports throughout the year, which will allow you to see orbit charts and trends across industries. And we'll also be putting all of this data and maturity models into our community, which is launching in October, which we would encourage people to sign up for our community. It's in beta test now, but we're in the process of putting all of these in. I've got a couple of other questions I'm going to just hit really quickly. Do we recommend a supply chain center of excellence? I do, but I think you've got to be very clear about excellence, what it means. I think you've got to focus on pull, not push. So in other words, being pulled into the line of business versus pushing and audits. And third, you've got to have a very clear supply chain strategy. If you have those elements and you have a clear governance model and charter, then I think it can help. Do I see any trends on owning assets versus moving towards 3PLs? I don't see any trends right now, but I got to tell you that some of the work that we've done in moving to 3PLs bothers me. What I see in the orbit charts for the 3PLs is very low margin, lack of resiliency and progress, and I ask myself the question of, are we causing risk for the supply chain? Okay, well, thank you for your questions, and I hope to see you in the community, and please join us for future webinars. We do these every month, and they're on our website, and follow me on Forbes and Twitter and LinkedIn, and on my website, The Supply Chain Shaman. Thanks for joining us today, and let us know what you think about the methodology. We want to hear from you. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Laura, and I want to thank everyone for attending today. Just a few quick things as we leave the webinar. As I mentioned, we're going to send out the slides to everyone as well as the recording link to the webinar, so please keep an eye out in your email for that by tomorrow. As Laura mentioned, we also encourage you to engage with us on social media, so you can follow us on Twitter, join our LinkedIn company page, and follow us on SlideShare. And finally, if you have any questions about your supply chain, please don't hesitate to reach out to us because we're here to help. Thanks.